Welcome. The material you've shared with us today it's a challenging and truly comprehensive look at the life and legacy of Henry Ford.
It really is.
When you start to examine the totality of his work, you realize it's impossible to talk about the invention of the Model T, which is this single object that really mobilized the world,
Right.
without also talking about the revolutionary societal changes he pioneered and the deeply troubling prejudices he helped to systematize.
It's a remarkable, almost unsettling complexity. Our goal here is really a full exploration, tracing Ford, the brilliant engineer and industrialist, alongside Ford, the authoritarian publisher, and the virulent isolationist.
Exactly.
This is the man who pioneered what we call Fordism, this whole system of mass production and high wages that fundamentally redefined the middle class.
But at the same time, he was this relentless opponent of organized labor and, you could argue, the most powerful promoter of anti-Semitism in America during the 1920s and 30s. The facts just create this intense paradox. He was born in Spring Wells Township, Michigan in 1863 and lived all the way until 1947. He wasn't just an inventor. He was an engineer, an industrialist, a newspaper publisher,
And a philanthropist later on,
and a philanthropist dedicated to preserving Americana. I mean, his creation of the $5 minimum daily wage, the 5-day work week, those are cornerstones of modern labor.
They are.
But they're also tied completely to this vision of total corporate control and, frankly, some malicious personal beliefs.
And you have to hold those two truths together in tension, because that duality shaped the entire 20th century. He innovated not just in machine design, but in social structure.
How so?
He intended to use high wages as a means of social control, while at the same time ensuring his workers were wealthy enough to become the very consumers who would buy the products rolling off his assembly lines. That fundamental tension between his technological brilliance and his moral authoritarianism, that's the engine that drives everything we're about to discuss.
Okay, let's unpack this by starting in the beginning. Let's talk about his formative years and his just relentless mechanical prowess. Where does the origin story of this global industrialist begin?
It begins with a simple fact. He despised farming.
Hated it.
Absolutely hated it. Ford was a mechanical prodigy, and he saw farm life as just arduous and inefficient. So he left the farm in Springwells at 16 to become an apprentice machinist in Detroit.
But the obsession with mechanics, this started way earlier than that, didn't it?
Oh, much earlier. The sources really emphasize that when he was just 12, he got a pocket watch. By 15, he had already disassembled and reassembled dozens of watches for friends and neighbors. He had a reputation.
A local watch repairman.
Exactly. It earned him some pocket money.
So that early tinkering with these precise, tiny mechanisms that led directly to much bigger engines. And it was all driven by a key observation he made.
Yes. 1875 is a pivotal year. At age 12, he saw his first automobile other than horse-drawn, as he put it. It was a Nichols and Shepard road engine.
And seeing that machine just lumbering down the road, it put him on a clear path. A path fueled by his skepticism of the power sources they had at the time.
That observation was absolutely crucial. After seeing it, he started experimenting with steam power, even built a functional steam wagon, but he rejected steam.
Why?
Primarily because of the danger. The high-pressure boiler you needed to generate enough power was just too risky for widespread personal use.
And electricity was out too.
Right. He rejected electricity too, citing the huge expense of setting up trolley wires and the fact that there was no practical high-capacity battery technology at the time. So this process of elimination is what led him to focus exclusively on the gasoline engine.
And his development timeline shows a very systematic, almost obsessive approach. He repairs an auto engine around 1885, builds his own four-cycle model in 87, and by 1890, he's building a 2-cylinder engine in his spare time.
Right. This wasn't some flash of inspiration. It was a methodical, decade-long process of just iteration and improvement.
And he finally got the time he needed to focus on this when he joined the Edison Illuminating Company in Detroit.
Exactly. That was in 1891. He was hardworking, efficient, and got promoted to chief engineer in 1893. That new position was critical. It gave him the income, the steady hours, and a workshop where he could dedicate himself fully to his engine experiments.
Which all culminated in the famous quadricycle in 1896. He finished it and test drove it on June 4th of that year.
And there's a fantastic detail in the sources about his mentor, Thomas Edison.
Oh, right.
At a meeting of Edison executives, Edison himself gave Ford his approval, encouraging him to abandon steam completely and focus on the future of the light, self-contained gasoline engine.
Imagine getting that validation from the era's greatest inventor.
It must have been a massive boost. But, turning that technical success into a business success, that proved to be a lot harder at first.
His first venture, the Detroit Automobile Company, founded in 1899, it failed pretty quickly. By January 1901, it was done.
And why? The cars were customized, they were high-priced, and the quality just wasn't what Ford wanted. They were essentially toys for the rich, not the durable machines for the masses that he dreamed of building.
He learned fast that technical skill and commercial viability were two different things.
Yeah.
So his response to that failure was strategic. He turned to racing.
He did. He turned to racing to generate buzz, to prove the durability of his engines, and to secure the capital he needed. He partnered with a former racer, Tom Cooper, and they just built these incredibly high-horsepower race cars.
Most notably, the 909.
Yes, in 1902, named after the fastest locomotive of the day. And this car was pure spectacle. It had over 80 horsepower, and Ford himself drove it to set a new American land speed record in January 1904.
Hitting an astonishing 91.3 miles per hour on the frozen surface of Lake St. Clair.
Just an incredible speed for the time.
And this racing fame wasn't just about ego, it was strategic. He had Barney Oldfield race the 999 around the country, making the Ford name known for speed and reliability. And that success, that's what secured the investor backing that led to the Ford Motor Company.
Which brings us to our second phase here, the era of mass production and the Model T revolution.
The Ford Motor Company was incorporated on June 16, 1903, with an initial capitalization of just $28,000.
And it had a really diverse set of initial investors, including two important names. The Dodge brothers, who were supplying engine and chassis components.
Well, Yam's Cousins, who was a key figure from the start.
But it's important to note the leadership tension right away. Ford wasn't immediately made president.
No, John S. Gray was. Why was that?
The other investors were concerned about Ford's volatility. That was the word they used. It was really a euphemism for his single-minded stubbornness and his desire for absolute control.
But despite that, he took control of the vision pretty quickly.
Oh, immediately. The engineering and the strategic vision were all Ford. And that vision came together completely with the Model T, which debuted on October 1st, 1908.
It was revolutionary, not because it was the fastest or the prettiest, but because it was designed for the average person, especially people in rural areas.
It standardized the left side steering wheel, which was soon copied everywhere. Crucially, the engine and transmission were enclosed, the cylinders were cast in a solid block, and the car was celebrated for being simple, durable, and
inexpensive to repair.
That was key. Think about the impact of that simplicity. For a farmer or a small-town mechanic, the Model T was designed to be fixed with basic tools and easy-to-find parts.
It was engineered for standardization.
Exactly. It reduced the complexity and the cost of ownership that had plagued all the earlier cars.
And the true revolution, the Fordism that changed everything, was affordability driven by production volume. It initially sold for $825, but that price dropped every single year.
And that was deliberate. Ford consciously pushed prices down to expand the market. By the 1920s, a Model T cost under $300.
Making it accessible to the middle class. The sources say a majority of American drivers actually learned on the Model T. It was completely ubiquitous.
He created a whole ecosystem. He didn't just sell cars. He created a massive publicity machine, making sure every newspaper had stories and ads. He set up a franchise system of local dealers that made the car available on 6 continents.
And he marketed it specifically to farmers, right?
Yeah.
As a tool, not a luxury.
Yes, a tool to help their business. Sales just exploded. Sometimes they posted 100% gains year after year.
But the real logistical game changer was introduced in 1913. The moving assembly belt. This is the innovation everyone associates with Ford.
And here we have to inject some nuance from the source material. While Ford championed and implemented the concept, the sources are clear that the actual development came from a team of his very talented employees.
People like Clarence Avery, Peter Martin, Charles Sorensen.
And C. Harold Wills. What they achieved was astronomical. The assembly lines enabled such a huge increase in production that sales reached 472,000 by 1916.
And this obsession with speed and efficiency is what led directly to that famous constraint on color.
Absolutely. The quote, Any customer can have a car painted any color that he wants so long as it is black. That was born purely from logistics.
Black paint just dried faster.
Significantly faster than any other color available at the time. If the cars had to wait for paint to dry, the whole assembly line would grind to a halt. It was a calculated sacrifice of variety for the sake of output.
And this pursuit of total control over output led Ford to an even more ambitious concept: vertical integration, centered at the River Rouge complex.
Vertical integration meant controlling the entire supply chain from the raw material to the finished product. He built the River Rouge complex in Dearborn, and it became the largest integrated factory in the world.
They brought in iron ore at one end,
Smelted the steel, stamped the parts, and drove the finished cars out the other end. This allowed Ford to slash costs by cutting out middlemen and suppliers. It gave him an unprecedented level of control over quality and, crucially, over the price.
This ambition for total control extended beyond the production line and right into the boardroom. Ford was determined to have absolute control, free from shareholders or banks. In 1918, he handed the presidency to his son Edsel.
Nominally.
Nominally, yes.
Yeah.
Henry kept final authority and often reversed Edsel's decisions. And to consolidate power, in 1919, he created a ruse. He started a separate company, Henry Ford and Son, and threatened to move his best people there.
This was a tactic aimed squarely at forcing the remaining minority stockholders to sell. But there's a key piece of background here that explains his paranoia: the Dodge brothers.
Who were key early investors and suppliers.
Right. And when Ford decided to stop paying dividends to reinvest in the company, the Dodge brothers, who were planning their own car company by then, sued him to force a dividend payment.
That's the famous Dodge v. Ford Motor Company case, which Ford lost in 1919. It affirmed that stockholders had a right to profits.
Precisely. And that loss just solidified his obsession with sole control. His ruse worked. It pressured all the remaining stockholders to sell their stakes. Henry and Edsel bought them all out for $106 million.
Giving the Ford family complete sole ownership of the company. He finally had the unilateral power he'd always wanted.
But that unilateral control, as you said, sometimes led to some catastrophic business decisions and a real resistance to evolution. By the mid-1920s, General Motors was rising fast under Alfred Sloan.
And Sloan's strategy was the price ladder.
A car for every person purpose. GM sold Chevrolets for the masses, Oldsmobiles for the middle, and Cadillacs for the elite. And crucially, they encouraged consumers to trade up every few years using installment payment plans.
And Ford resisted replacing the Model T for 16 long years. He just thought his simple, cheap car was all anyone needed.
That resistance was incredibly costly. Model T sales started to slide and slide fast as people wanted more comfort, style, and variety. It forced Henry to finally give in and approve a successor.
Which required an 18-month shutdown of the entire River Rouge complex to retool. That must have cost a fortune.
Millions. And it allowed GM to consolidate its lead. The result was the Model A, launched in 1927. It was successful, but Ford still resisted popular ideas like hydraulic brakes and all-metal roofs, which GM was already offering.
So his cars didn't get those innovations until the mid-30s. It shows that his genius for mechanics struggled with modern consumer marketing.
It did. But you can't discount his engineering entirely. In 1932, he dropped what was called a bombshell on the industry, the flathead Ford V8.
The first low-price 8-cylinder engine ever mass-produced.
It was a stroke of genius, both technically and strategically. It immediately cemented Ford's reputation for performance, and it was loved by hot rodders and police alike. It showed that even as he aged, he still understood mechanical excellence.
And this was also around the time Edsel successfully pushed to launch Mercury in 1939 as a mid-range brand to challenge Dodge and Buick.
Finally acknowledging that price ladder strategy.
Which leads us into our next and deeply complex section, Ford's controversial labor strategies. This part truly captures the paradox, where this humanitarian veneer masked a desire for total control.
It starts with what's called welfare capitalism. And Ford implemented this not out of pure altruism, but to solve a massive logistical problem: employee turnover.
It was huge, right?
Debilitatingly huge. Before his changes, the work was so brutal and the pay so low that some departments were hiring 300 men a year just to keep 100 slots filled. The cost of that constant hiring and training was just massive.
So his famous intervention was the $5 wage, announced in January 1914. He doubled the minimum daily pay from $2.34 to $5 for qualifying male workers.
The effects were immediate and spectacular. It attracted the best mechanics in Detroit, it boosted productivity, and it dramatically lowered those costly turnover rates.
And Ford's justification was multi-layered?
It was, yes. He saw it as a form of profit sharing.
Yeah.
But the revolutionary economic angle was his public argument that paying employees more would enable them to afford the cars they were producing.
Creating a new consumer class.
Exactly. Boosting the whole economy and insulating his own sales from recessions.
That is the essence of Fordism, creating both the means of production and the consumers to sustain it. But as you said, this came with an enormous, intrusive cost to personal freedom.
That cost was administered by the social department. To qualify for the $5 wage, a worker had to have his private life approved by Ford's investigators.
What does that mean, approved? What were they looking for?
They were looking for moral compliance. The social department had 50 investigators who did home visits and background checks. They frowned on heavy drinking, gambling, not saving money, not supporting your family.
So if you were deemed immoral, you were knocked back down to the lower wage, regardless of your skill.
That's right. He was essentially monitoring their private lives, their spending habits, their moral code, in exchange for a living wage.
It's intense, manipulative paternalism disguised as corporate benevolence.
It was industrial authoritarianism. Though Ford himself later wrote in his 1922 memoir that paternalism has no place in the industry, saying they had shifted methods, but the spirit of control that remained.
He followed this up in 1926 with another huge innovation, the 5-day work week, 40 hours a week for factory workers.
And again, his reasoning was a blend of social idealism and economic pragmatism. He believed leisure time was good for business.
Because it gave workers time to consume more goods.
Exactly. Benefiting the broader economy. He said it was high time to rid ourselves of the notion that leisure for workmen is either lost time or a class privilege, which was very progressive for the time.
However, that benevolence stopped abruptly and violently when it came to labor unions.
Absolutely. Ford was adamantly against unions. He saw them as outside forces, radicals who restricted productivity and threatened his control. And to manage this opposition, he promoted a very specific figure, Harry Bennett.
A former Navy boxer.
Yes. Ford put him in charge of the service department, which quickly became Ford's private paramilitary force. Bennett used intimidation, violence, and spying to ruthlessly quash any organizing efforts.
And this brings us to a very dark period of intense conflict and human tragedy. We have to pause here and really reflect on the immense human cost of Ford's stance.
Oh, we do.
The sources show how workers, often just seeking fair treatment, were met with corporate-sanctioned violence.
The consequences were indeed tragic, starting with the 1932 Ford Hunger March. During the Great Depression, unemployed auto workers demonstrated peacefully at the River Rouge complex. They were just trying to present their demands.
And they were met with immediate, deadly force. Dearborn police and Ford security guards opened fire on the marchers. Over 60 injuries and 5 deaths.
It was a brutal, inexcusable reaction to a peaceful demonstration.
And the violence continued. In 1937, you have the infamous Battle of the Overpass.
A widely publicized event where Bennett's security men brutally beat UAW members, including the union leader Walter Reuther, in broad daylight on a public overpass near the plant.
And the specifics of that event are crucial. The supervising police chief on the scene was an alumnus of Bennett's service department. He just stood by and let it happen.
He did nothing. But the next day, harrowing photos of the beaten UAW members were in newspapers nationwide, which was a huge PR disaster for Ford.
And the irony is, Edsel Ford, the company president, he recognized that a union contract was inevitable and necessary. But Henry refused.
Utterly refused. He kept Bennett in charge specifically to make sure no agreement was ever reached. He saw any cooperation as capitulation.
The stalemate finally broke in 1941 during UAW's sit-down strike that completely shut down the River Rouge plant.
Henry Ford was distraught, famously threatening to break up the company rather than recognize the union. He only agreed to negotiate after a pivotal intervention.
From his wife, Clara.
Yes. She delivered an ultimatum. She threatened to leave him if he destroyed the family business through this continuous, chaotic resistance. Faced with that, he finally complied.
It's remarkable. The man who defied investors, the government, the unions for decades, he folded because of his wife's demand.
Overnight, the company went from the most stubborn anti-union holdout to signing one of the most favorable UAW contracts in the industry.
That tendency to see everything through a lens of conspiracy and external enemies, that leads us directly into the next section, where we have to confront the most controversial parts of Ford's life. His anti-Semitism, his isolationism, and his global business practices.
Ford's political worldview was defined by a strong isolationist streak. He saw war as the ultimate waste. This led him to fund the famous peace ship in 1915, trying to stop World War I.
A mission that was a complete failure and widely ridiculed.
It was seen as naive and a publicity stunt. Ford abandoned the mission in Norway and came home. But that failure, it cemented his conspiratorial view that German Jewish bankers and greedy financiers were responsible for the war.
So his isolationism became deeply intertwined with this prejudice.
And it manifested most dangerously in his publishing efforts. In 1918, Ford bought his hometown newspaper, the Dearborn Independent.
And starting about a year and a half later, the paper began publishing this shocking, systematic series of articles under Ford's name, claiming a vast Jewish conspiracy was affecting America.
These articles ran in 91 issues and were later bound into 4 volumes called The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem.
And the spread of this material was strategic. Ford dealers across the country were required to distribute the newspaper to their customers, ensuring a massive reach.
And beyond that, Ford personally financed the printing and distribution of 500,000 copies of the foundational anti-Semitic text his articles were based on, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
And we must stress this. The Protocols is a complete and dangerous fabrication. It's a known forgery, created by Russian secret police, claiming to document a secret Jewish plan for global domination.
So Ford was intentionally propagating known malicious conspiracy theories using his vast industrial network. The sources confirm that with around 700,000 readers at its peak, he became the spokesman for right-wing extremism and religious prejudice in America.
And the reach of his hate was global and profound. In Germany, the International Jew was instrumental in shaping the foundation of Nazi anti-Semitic ideology. Heinrich Himmler wrote in 1924 that Ford was one of our most valuable, important, and witty fighters.
And the connection to Adolf Hitler is particularly chilling. Ford is the only American mentioned favorably in Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf.
Hitler reportedly kept a life-size portrait of Ford behind his desk and said, "I regard Henry Ford as my inspiration," even modeling the Volkswagen Beetle, the people's car, on the Model T.
And the Nazi regime acknowledged this publicly. In July 1938, on Ford's 75th birthday, the German consul awarded him the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest medal Nazi Germany could give a foreigner.
This eventually led to legal action in the U.S. A libel lawsuit brought by a Jewish farm cooperative organizer named Aaron Shapiro ultimately forced Ford to close the Independent in 1927.
He did issue a public apology, claiming he was shocked and unaware of the content.
But the credibility of that apology is, well, it's hotly debated.
It is. Testimony during the trial suggested Ford did know about the content in advance, and journalists at the time noted that the apology might have been motivated by his slumping car sales as boycotts were starting to hurt business.
And most alarmingly, some sources allege Ford never even signed the retraction, that Harry Bennett forged his signature. And later, in 1940, Ford privately said he still hoped to republish the International Jew someday.
Which strongly suggests the 1927 apology was a commercial necessity, not a genuine change of heart. The lasting influence is tragically undeniable. At the Nuremberg trials, a convicted Hitler youth leader testified that the decisive anti-Semitic book that influenced him was Ford's The International Jew.
Ford maintained his isolationist stance as World War II approached, opposing U.S. entry. Again, he cited greedy financiers, a thinly veiled code for Jews, as the instigators. He was eventually forced to resign from the executive board of the America First Committee.
But despite his personal opposition to war, the conflict demanded his industrial capacity. Responding to President Roosevelt's call for America to become the great arsenal of democracy, Ford directed the construction of the massive new aircraft factory at Willow Run.
An engineering marvel, the largest assembly line in the world at the time. Ford adapted his mass production techniques to air power.
At its peak, the factory was completing a B-24 bomber almost every hour. Ultimately, Ford produced 9,000 B-24s at Willow Run, half of all the B-24s produced during the entire war.
But here we have to confront the duality of Ford's global empire during the war. While Willow Run was a symbol of American ingenuity, his German subsidiary, Ford Work, was actively using French prisoners of war as slave laborers to support the German war machine.
The very system Ford created was operating on both sides of the conflict, driven by the logic of continuous production.
That brings us to his later life and retirement. The death of his son Edsel in 1943 from cancer profoundly impacted the company.
Following Edsel's death, Henry Ford, nearly 80 years old, nominally resumed the presidency. But his health was failing. He'd had multiple cardiovascular events, his mental acuity was declining, and he was easily manipulated by people like Harry Bennett.
The company fell into chaos. The sources paint a stark picture. By 1945, Ford Motor Company was losing over $10 million a month. The situation was so bad, the Roosevelt administration considered a government takeover to stabilize B-24 production.
That financial collapse is what finally forced a change. In 1945, Ford's wife, Clara, and his daughter-in-law, Eleanor, confronted him. They delivered an ultimatum.
They threatened to sell their family stock, 3/4 of the company, if he refused to retire.
He ceded control to his grandson, Henry Ford II, who immediately fired Harry Bennett, dismantling the oppressive service department.
And while the end of his professional reign was tumultuous, he maintained other interests, particularly in material science.
He did. He was an enthusiastic adopter of new steel alloys and was very interested in finding industrial uses for agricultural products, especially plastics derived from plants.
He had a close research relationship with George Washington Carver, specifically focusing on soybeans.
Right. Soybean-based plastics were used in car parts throughout the 1930s. His research culminated in a 1942 prototype plastic car that was 30% lighter than a steel car. He was always pursuing self-sufficiency.
He also left us with a non-automotive staple, Kingsford charcoal.
Developed by his brother-in-law, Edward Kingsford, using the enormous volume of wood scraps and sawdust from the Model T factories.
And finally, he dedicated a lot of time and money to preserving Americana, Greenfield Village, and the Edison Institute Museum in Dearborn.
His focus was on practical technology and the history of innovation. He also helped establish a research corporation with Thomas Edison and Harvey Firestone to find a Native American source of rubber.
He was ultimately honored for his industrial achievements. In 1946, he was recognized at the Automotive Golden Jubilee for putting the world on wheels. He died the next year, in 1947, from a cerebral hemorrhage at age 83.
Which brings us to our final examination of the material and a synthesis of his total impact.
When you put all of it together, the Model T, the $5 wage, the assembly line, the River Rouge complex, the violent opposition to labor, and the propagation of hatred, Henry Ford's legacy is defined by massive scale, vertical integration, and the creation of the affordable consumer economy as we know it.
But that world-changing achievement is entirely and inextricably linked to his authoritarian control and his unprecedented use of mass media to spread dangerous conspiracy theories. He directly inspired others, including Adolf Hitler. His influence even entered our culture. Aldous Huxley's Brave New World dates years A.F. Anno Ford and replaces the cross with a capital T.
It's a complex, uncomfortable history. It demands this careful consideration, balancing the engineering breakthroughs that improved life for millions with the devastating social costs of his hatreds and his tyrannical labor tactics. He simultaneously enabled the middle class and degraded the spirit of his workforce.
And this leaves us with a provocative thought to consider regarding his contradictions. Ford championed economic independence for the U.S. through vertical integration and isolationism. Yet he also believed that international trade and industrial capitalism would inevitably lead to world peace.
An isolationist who built factories worldwide.
Exactly. So, did the massive economic system he created, Fordism, based on international dealerships and global factories, did it ultimately prove more powerful than his own isolationist and racist impulses? Did the machine he engineered ultimately operate outside the control of its own inventor's worst beliefs?
Thanks for listening.